Okay, great. Thank you, Gail. I'm going to talk a little bit about a project that we've been working on at the University of Houston. It seems like I've been working on this project in some capacity or other since I started at U of H about 3.5 years ago, and more recently became more active, and it's really picking up speed lately with the release of Haiku and the transition of Avalon Media System to Fedora 4. We're really starting to see some progress on what we're doing. So very briefly, I'll give you a background, a little bit of a history of the project, an overview of the Bayou City dams, the workflow architecture that we've devised, kind of a vision for this ecosystem of tools that'll help us get our digital collections into our repositories, and give you a brief overview of all the tools that we've developed along the way, and then talk a little bit about the next steps for the project. This Bayou City Dams started about 3 years ago with the formation of 2 UH Libraries task forces, a DAMS, Digital Asset Management System Implementation Task Force, and the Digital Preservation Task Force. These were 2 task forces that were sanctioned by the Libraries Administration and worked in parallel. There was some crossover in membership between the 2, and a little bit difference in scope. We've been using repositories for access for many years, since the late 2000s with Content DM. And so we understood as an institution how to get stuff into the repository, how to manage a repository, but we didn't really have a preservation program to speak of. So the scope of the Digital Preservation Task Force was to survey the digital preservation landscape, to determine best practices, to select a system to use for digital preservation, and then to develop a policy as well for our libraries, for our digital objects. And at the end of that about year and a half long process, we delivered a recommendation to the Libraries Administration to set up an architecture for access and preservation based on Fedora and Hydra at the time. I should put the new Samvera logo in there, as well as archive space for archival management and Archivematica for preservation. I want to give a shout out to our project team. This is the first time I've delivered this presentation by myself. There's usually at least 3 or 4 other people up here. I might mention Sandy Thompson, who's in the audience, who's part of our steering committee for the Bayou City Dams project. And we have a cross-functional team with expertise from throughout the libraries. So we have folks from archives, folks from AV, imaging, metadata, systems, and development. So we have a large team, and we're self-organizing, so we bring people in with expertise as needed to get done what we need to do. So the Bayou City Dams was a moniker that we gave to our project about a year ago when we first started implementing workflow tools and systems towards the goal of building a Haiku and Avalon and Archivematica archive space repository system. Houston is sometimes known as the Bayou City. So all of the tools that you'll see today are named after bayous in the Houston metropolitan area. That was a nice byproduct of choosing Bayou City Dams, because if we need to have another, if we see the need for another tool, we just go to the list of Bayou names, and it's very easy to choose a name for that tool. It can be difficult sometimes to name software, and so we have that built-in naming system for us. We've adopted some agile methodologies. We're still trying to work that out. It's very new to most of our team. Most of us are librarians and library staff who don't have much experience in technology projects, so we've been experimenting with agile methodologies. We've adopted Slack. Everybody loves it on our team, and we're collaborating asynchronously on GitHub as well, using the wikis and submitting issues and sharing code that way. So this is the ecosystem that we've come up with. I'm going to break it down a little bit, so if you don't know what's going on right now, I'll do my best to explain it as we go along. But it's really a vision for getting our digitized files from digitization through descriptive metadata and into both preservation and access with persistent identification and multiple pathways to get to both preservation and access objects. We're relying heavily on persistent identification as a way to effectively manage our objects over time. So I'll break down very briefly, or kind of roughly, the preservation and access workflows. Going across the top of the diagram here, we have our digitized files that go through our Carpenter's digitization workflow application that mints identifiers for each preservation package. It's grabbing the preservation metadata spec from our metadata application profile, and then getting a collection hierarchy from archive space so that those files can be associated with a layer in the hierarchy, whether that's a series or a box or a folder. And then that packages up these preservation objects for ingest into Archivematica. The access workflow on the bottom grabs the metadata application profile spec for the access objects and uses our CEDAR authority control system to bring in named entities, people, places, subjects. All of those named entities have a persistent identifier minted for them. And then the Braze metadata descriptive metadata creation and editing tool helps us to create descriptive metadata for those objects and then package them up for ingest into either Haiku or Avalon. Along the way, during ingest, we'll be minting ARC identifiers for all the objects that we can then post to the appropriate location in the archival hierarchy if it happens to be an archival collection. So I'll very briefly to give you a tour of some of these workflow tools and how they fit into this vision for an ecosystem of components that do one thing really well. Our idea was to set up these tools to re-envision a way of doing things that wouldn't be too much of a departure from the way that we're doing things now. So all of our descriptive metadata creation and constructing these objects happens outside of our access system right now. And we wanted to build these tools in a way that would allow us to transition well to the new system without having too much too much training to do for our staff and have familiar interfaces that they can work with. And I'm happy to say that both our Carpenter's application and Braze application are in use right now. We've adapted them to work with Content DM, so our staff are already using some of these tools to create data. I'll start with our BCDAM's map or metadata application profile. It's a Jekyll static site. It's a site built with the Jekyll static site generator that has an API that our applications use. And we really wanted to go to a simplified metadata schema because our current Content DM installation has over 75 unique fields, and we really wanted to boil that down to make it easier for our metadata creators to understand what's going on, and then our users to have a cleaner interface to look at. And we also wanted to align with the DPLA map, the Digital Public Library of America, because we knew that Haiku would be moving in that direction. So the sooner we could begin to create metadata according to that schema, the better off we'd be in the long run. It has a user interface for metadata creators so they can access guidelines if they have a question about how to create values for a specific field. And as I mentioned, it has an API for our workflow tools. So if we need to, we can change our metadata spec in one place, and then that replicates throughout all of our systems. We point our applications at the map, and then it knows what fields to display, what type of head values it should draw in from people and places from CEDAR. And then we're using it for automated authority control. So we have that type of head feature in the Braze application that will give our metadata creators controlled values. This is the public-facing interface of the BCDAM's map. It provides a little bit of information about each of the fields in our spec. And then this is the JSON, or the snippet of the JSON that's delivered to the Braze application, so it knows how to handle each of these fields and which fields to display in the interface. The same holds true for Carpenters, which brings in its own fields from the API of the BCDAMS map. And this is our digitization workflow tool, so it's the first stop in the workflow. You might think of each of these applications as a bayou through which all the data in our systems are flowing. And so it's a way to manage the stream and make sense of it. So the first step happens in special collections. If it happens to be an archival collection, our curators can find the finding aid in archive space and load that intellectual hierarchy into the application. Then they'll select the intellectual components from that hierarchy. So it's just checking boxes according to which boxes and folders or series happen to have items to be digitized to create a kind of a shot list. And then after the files have been digitized, it gives an interface for associating those digitized files with the appropriate component in the archival hierarchy. And then at the end of that process, we're able to export both a SIP for the preservation system and a DIP to go through the descriptive metadata pipeline. So this is the selection interface for a finding aid. You can see that those green boxes show that there's something selected in the hierarchy below. So a curator can just go through with the actual files in special collections and select the appropriate level of the hierarchy. And then after files have been digitized, we can load them into this interface, the files interface, and we have a naming scheme that allows us to sometimes automatically assign files to the appropriate layer in the hierarchy, but if all else fails, you can also drag and drop the file names from the right side of the interface into either the preservation, modified master, or access copy files columns. And then we can export a SIP and a DIP, as well as mint that ARC identifier for the package. So after all that is done, we get a log that is included in the SIP that's sent to preservation to give some extra information about what has been done. And these are both the SIP and the DIP. We started off thinking of a SIP like a collection as a preservation object. About a year ago, we started developing towards that model, and we, in recent testing, we found that that broke down pretty quickly. We had some throughput issues with that model, and so we're going back to the drawing board to think of maybe our preservation objects in more discrete components, and to identify more granular content types that we can use to write rules for the Carpenter's application. So that's going to be an area of development for the next 6 months or so as we approach the end of the year. The next stop in the data flow is the Braze descriptive metadata editor that provides our metadata creators with an editing interface, a GUI, like a form field that you'd find on the web. It reads a Carpenter's DIP, both the metadata CSV and the files that were included, and it integrates with the BCDAMS map so that as we change the map, as we add or remove fields, Braze creates its interface from that API. It provides basic validation, so it will tell us if a field is missing, if a data value is incorrect, if it's not authorized, integrating with the Cedar vocabulary manager to do that. So this is what Braze looks like on our Galveston 1915 hurricane photographs collection. And you can see we're using color coding to show when an object still requires metadata work. So those red items up there mean that it still has something that hasn't been filled in. And we can use these fields to fill in the descriptive metadata. There's a type ahead interface, so like the subject field, when you begin typing in a value, it draws in the authorized values from our Cedar vocabulary manager to give our metadata creators some options. And it has a built-in image viewer too. So our metadata creators, if they need to view an image for description, they can look at it from directly within this application. Our Cedar local vocabulary manager is a Rails app that's based on the IQVOC SCOS vocabulary management gem. And we use that. We're using this for authority control, for workflow efficiency. It's a lot easier to look up controlled terms in this application, and we don't need access to the full LC subject headings or any of these other vocabularies. So we can begin to build up a local vocabulary that is tailored to our specific collections. And it provides linked data serialization, so all of our authority terms are linked to external vocabularies, and they're served up in a variety of formats. So here's an example of one entry into the system. In the concept mappings tab, you can see that it's linked to authorities in id.loc.gov and the Getty AAT, as well as our own ARC identifier that we've minted. It also is served in a number of representations. So there's RDF XML, Turtle, and N triples. And so all of these terms that we're minting are served up as linked data. And central to a lot of what we're doing is the greens identifier, minter, and resolver. We saw that early on. This was the first application that we worked on. It's a Rails app that mints archival resource key identifiers. And it will resolve those ARC identifiers to a target URL. So similar to what something like the EasyID service does. It conforms to the ARC specification, so if you append a question mark to the end of the URL for an ARC, it'll give you something like this ERC record that shows who created it, who this entity, what it is, when it was created, and where it currently lives in our system. So when we're migrating systems in the future, all we have to do is update this where statement to wherever the object, the entity is living in our next system. So as I showed a little bit earlier, it's integrated with greens. That's one of the things that our developer, Sean, added to the IQVOC base gem. And one of the last tools that I'll show you is halls. Early on in the process, our Special Collections Department has been heavily involved in our digital collections process from the beginning of our digital library, and it's very important for them to be able to view collections in an archival context. And we knew that that might be a sticking point for the next repository system that we selected because those weren't specifically designed to show digital objects in an archival context. So we wanted to provide a proof of concept for building an interface on top of archive space that would show digital objects within that context that is important to them. So Sean created this customized archive space interface that allows you to browse a digitized archival collection. It sits on top of archive space, and it shows the archival context and sequence of objects within its original context. So this is our Texas music collection shown through the halls interface. And it gives you standard overview, scope and contents. And then as you scroll down, you can see that this folder 18 in box 4 has some digitized objects. So from there you can, it kind of simulates browsing through the archival stacks. It'll also, once you click into that particular object, you can see all the thumbnails for the digitized objects. It's drawing in those thumbnails this is actually drawing them in from Content DM. So we can If we choose to continue development of this application, we're also closely watching projects like ArcLight, and as well as the archive space front-end redesign to see if those might better suit our needs and kind of align with our desire to adopt community solutions wherever we can. But we're working with our special collections folks to find a solution that will allow them to access our digital objects in the way that is appropriate for them. So our next steps, we've kind of adopted this Samvera motto of if you want to go far, go together. And as Haiku gets up to speed and as we're able to use that as a repository, we really want to be able to help give back to the community and kind of contribute our expertise around this. We've been thinking about migrations for a long time now. When I first started at U of H, I was new to Content DM. I didn't know anything about it, and I kind of knew that we would want to migrate at some point. And so I've been, ran out of power. I think we're going to need some help with that. I can. That was my last slide, so I think I can continue without it. But we recently submitted an IMLS grant to build something called the Bridge to Haiku, which would be a resource that would help folks understand migration needs in general, to understand what they might need to do to the data in their repositories in order to be able to migrate effectively, and then understand the requirements of Haiku and whether or not that is appropriate for them, and then develop tooling and documentation around migrating from Content DM to Haiku. And we've assembled a number of collaborators with varied expertise from around Canada and the United States who are operating Content DM repositories and can help us to build this resource. So should it be awarded, we are looking forward to producing something that the community can really benefit from, and we'd be welcoming contributions from anybody who might have some interest in that project. So I guess, thank you.
Does anybody have questions for Andrew? Must have some question.
Andrew, the title of the presentation, I think, was building an ecosystem for preservation and access. Can you elaborate a little bit on the preservation features or the preservation perspective?
Thank you, Tom. That's easily been the most challenging aspect of this entire project. If we were to do this over again, I think we would have had a far more crossover between those two parallel task forces from the beginning, because it seems like there's different assumptions made by both teams. And coming from an access background, I didn't fully understand everything that our preservationists were talking about when we first started working together to build this ecosystem. I think we've had a number of challenges around data modeling. To understand the differences between modeling data for preservation and modeling for access. And this whole notion of finding a workflow that accommodates both preservation and access concerns is a real challenge. Like it's been difficult for us with little experience in the preservation sphere to begin to understand how we can build a workflow that accommodates both of those very important aspects of producing and providing access to digital collections over the long term. So it's something we're still working on. We still have a lot of way to go to find something that is going to work for our preservation and access teams. But I think we're confident that we can find something that's going to work over the long term. And it becomes especially difficult for the preservation end, because you start to have to think about infrastructure and the costs associated with storing large amounts of data over the long term. So we're beginning to have those conversations at an administrative level as well about the need over the long term to support preservation financially.
Any other questions? Great.
Hi, I'm Serena from the State Library of Queensland, and we're currently implementing a digital preservation system and struggling with issues around finding aids. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about the success you've had there. It looked like you'd come up with a good model, and is it something that your special collections team are happy with?
Yes, they're very excited about it. Since the beginning, when I started at U of H in metadata, there was kind of this sense from special collections that they didn't know what was happening to their stuff through this whole process, and then they were very keen to see the digital objects we'd produced at the very end. And there was a lot of back and forth that went on after that. And from the start of this project, we wanted to shift a lot of that burden to the beginning of the process. So they have a lot of control over the whole process now from the very beginning. So they'll create a finding aid, and through that, they have a lot of control over how their collection is being preserved and how access is provided to it. So they are confident that when they produce this finding aid and select the layers of the hierarchy that are going to be digitized at the end, they know that their objects are going to be more or less the way that they want them to be.
Thank you.